This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Dr. Kinneret Lahad. She's a senior lecturer in the Women and Gender Studies program at Tel Aviv University. Today we'll be talking about her new book. It's called A Table for One, Rescheduling Singlehood and Time. It was published by Manchester University Press just recently in 2017. Kinneret Lahad, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, welcome. Thank you.
So your study focuses on the temporal aspect of female singlehood. Women are referred to as still single. They're referred to as old spinsters. And of course, the ubiquitous presence of the biological clock. Why is it important to focus on the temporal aspect? And what light does it really shed on your analysis?
I think that in general, singlehood is, to a large extent, still very under-theorized and understudied. And I think that one of the biggest challenges for singlehood scholars today is trying to debunk the stereotypes and stigmas that single persons are subjected to on an everyday basis and also in an existential framework as well. And when I began my study, I actually was thinking of researching singlehood and social emotions, of trying to understand singlehood in relation to shame and humiliation and jealousy and anger and happiness. But the more I delved into the textual analysis, the more I've read about singlehood, I understood that the mechanisms of power are articulated through temporal models, through temporal notions, through temporal ordering, and mostly through temporal truth, which are articulated in a way which is very much naturalized. It is considered to be true and valid. You cannot argue with time. You cannot beat your biological clock. You are aging. Your time is running up. You have to get married. The sooner the better. All these expressions and all these articulations through which single persons understand themselves are articulated through the notion of time, through the language of time, which is still yet to be deconstructed by, the mainstream feminist and sociological agenda.
And that applies only to women, to single women?
No, absolutely not. Singlehood is a very gendered phenomena. And of course, it changes according to one's class and one's race and one's sexual orientation and one's religious orientation. So you cannot look at singlehood as a unified phenomena. It has to be regarded through an intersectional lens. Saying this, I'm of course arguing that single men are also subjected to stereotypes and stigmas, and how come he's still not married when he's 42 or he's 45, or what's wrong with him?
Which also is a temporal dimension.
Definitely.
Despite the lack of a biological clock.
Definitely. It's a different clock. It's a different social clock, but its rhythms and the way it is framed is different, for example, from single women.
Are you going to write a companion book to this book about single? But I'm serious. I think it's an interesting question because there's you say singlehood among women is understudied, but isn't it also under-researched among men as well? Maybe even less so because precisely of those social constructs focusing so much on the problematic of single women. Don't we leave out the other side of this as well?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I've been teaching singlehood now for, I think, on and off 9 years. And I constantly ask the students, write about masculinity, write about the masculine aspects of singlehood. This is fascinating because it challenges in so many ways our perceptions of men as providers, as successful fathers, as successful workers. The undercurrents of these ideals and perceptions of masculinity cannot be separated from our perception of men as being sexually active, as being providers, as being fathers, as having a continuous, having a lineage of someone who is your son and your daughter. So this makes a fascinating potential for future studies. Yet, I think that there are still relatively less studies about men because, to a large extent, the problem is considered to be the problem of women.
Let's go back to the age factor for a minute. It's so central to the book and how you look at singlehood. And you quote in your chapter about the specter of becoming an old maid, a classic form of how age and temporality influences perceptions of singlehood. You paraphrase an Israeli writer saying that not being young is like social death. This is your term. Is this really completely true in an era where, certainly in the U.S., the baby boomer generation has really changed what concepts of, who we are at certain ages really are? Isn't any of that changing both American culture and maybe seeping into the, Western culture in general? It seems like an image, the old maid, from previous decades. Have we not evolved?
I'd like to add to that and perhaps paraphrase Dana's question.
She's happy because she's getting time to think about the question. I see her smiling.
No,
Absolutely.
So does your model apply particularly to Israel? Are there any specifically Israeli traits to it?
Okay, so
Well,
these are two
yeah.
separate questions. Let's begin with the specter of the old maid, and haven't we evolved from that? Unfortunately, I can definitely say no. No, absolutely not. We might have acquired forms of political correctness. We might have acquired new discourses to talk about family and couplehood and parenthood. There are definitely social changes, and I suspect, hopefully, that due to the growing rates of single persons and hopefully due to the wonderful achievements of the feminist movements, that women will have more possibilities for emotional autonomy and economical autonomy and the ability to imagine their lives beyond marriage and couplehood. Saying this, of course, I'm not saying anything against marriage and couplehood, incorporating, of course, the feminist writing about marriage and family. But my book is not a polemic against the institution of family and marriage. My book tries, through debunking and through challenging these stereotypes of the old maid and how ageism and sexism and singleism pervades the way we talk and think about singlehood.
But how realistic is this to ever really extract the factor of age? I mean, in another part, you write about cultural assumptions in general that people have based on age. You quote Marlis Buchanan saying that social categories, qualities, rights, obligations, and motives are determined by age. Mm-hmm. Can we ever not do that? I mean, is it totally wrong to do that? After all, people do go through experiences in life, and age does make us into different people. Mm-hmm. So why shouldn't we attribute social qualities based on age, especially because it's an equalizer? It's not racial and ethnically divided. It's not a rich-poor divide. Can we ever really take age out of the social analysis?
I think we should try to understand, and as a sociologist, and I see myself also as a critical age studies scholar, following mainly the studies of Chaim Chazan, who was one of the first scholars to teach me to understand how the tyranny of age, of how age, beyond its capacity to give us orientation, to create laws, to create policies, how age is in itself is considered to be a parameter which explains, but is not to be explained. It is something we constantly perceive as something which is natural, relies or delivers the message of truth. And at the same time, we do not realize the force it has is a tool of measurement, as a tool of disciplining, as a tool of creating age hierarchies, as a tool for implementing ageism in so many ways. And here, as implementing ageism when it concerns single women, when they are constantly evaluated and I would even say humiliated through the parameter of age.
So singlehood is where that critique meets the feminist critique? Is that really the meeting point?
I think that through singlehood, we can understand how age and sexism and singleism, which means the stereotypes against single persons, is meeting one another. And actually, in some ways, it's a discursive alliance between these forces which feed one another. And instead of accepting these, I would even say, horrific assumptions, these degrading assumptions, what I'm trying to do in my research and in my book is to ask questions about these parameters and try to understand singlehood, not so steeped in this, I can never say that word in English.
Misogynist.
Yes.
So I want to go back to my earlier question that perhaps jumped the
so
gun.
do I. Yeah, I want you to go back to that
Perhaps I jumped the gun earlier, but I think that is still familial. You call it feminism, I think, in the book. Is that the term that is particularly strong and pronounced in a traditional society like Israel, and perhaps less so in more secular and less traditional societies in the West. But, I mean, Israel is in some ways midway between the West and the more traditional, even more traditional societies in other parts of the world. Does it lend itself to your kind of analysis because of this particular standing?
I think it's a nice fantasy we have about Israel and also about other countries. I think the differences are not as stark as we would assume. I think that often the differences can lie between the big city and the small city. If we think about England, if we think about the U.S., if we think about the U.S., for example, the differences between New York and New Jersey or New York and somewhere in the
Midwest.
Excluding Jewish New York, because Jewish New York is obsessed with families and children and procreation.
Definitely. So I think that, of course, the pro-natal context of Israeli society is different and deserves a unique analysis, which I undertake in my book. But still, studying singlehood and family life for so many years, and recently I've conducted a research with a colleague from Denmark, which we all have this fantasy of the Nordic countries of being this liberatory gender equality, providing people with the possibilities to live as they choose, etc., etc. And of course, the familial and the couplehood presumptions of what considers us to be successful, happy subjects, what provides us with a sense of belonging, with a sense of value, with a sense of respectability. I think there are more similarities between Israel to many other countries than we think.
I think that's true if you listen to conversations about this issue also from Americans. I mean, again, the social expectation and pressure does seem to be present, and there is a sort of romanticizing of that from Israel where people say, oh, we're so behind. I'm not sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's definitely much more complex. And I think the question of having children or not having children is definitely something which makes a huge difference.
Well, let's talk about that because obviously it's sort of the thing that overshadows the whole concept of this time narrative. And it makes me sort of go back to the question that this is not an entirely sort of arbitrary social construct that we can just say, let's change it tomorrow, because the biological clock is there. And people do ultimately want children, or many people, and society at large, human nature is kind of programmed that way. So is it totally unreasonable that age is linked to this? I mean, or maybe without even the normative judgment, is this something that could possibly be changed when so far the biological clocks aren't really changing?
Well, it's a very long answer, so I'll try to make it short. I'll try and make it short. Mirav Amir wrote a beautiful thesis and have written some wonderful papers on how the biological clock is a metaphor, which is often used to regulate women's lives and actually in so many ways put them back in their place. So she connects this to various forms of backlash and discourses which view the success of women or the emancipation of middle upper class women as to be too threatening. One of the purposes in my book was not to narrow women's experiences to the biological clock. I think our experiences are much more rich and much more diverse, and a woman's body and dreams and longings cannot be boiled down to the rhythms of her biological clock, not every woman wants to have kids. Many women can be ambivalent. Many women, as the wonderful research of my dear friend and colleague Orna Donat, can even regret being mothers and taking upon this path. So I think this book...
I hope our kids aren't listening.
I think this book situates itself among this criticism, which hopefully will enable women and hopefully also men to look about and evaluate themselves, not according to the fact that if they had or not have children. And of course, this leads to so many other
questions such as mine.
Repercussions. And questions such as yours, for example.
So to what
Yes.
extent is really childlessness crucial in this matrix? To what extent is it really... it seems to me like it's really intertwined in your analysis. Can the two be separated? Can you look at singlehood or the problems with singlehood or the social construct of singlehood without this specter of childlessness?
And I will point out that as in your categories of single women, you do not include single mothers.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I could even take the way you just raised the question now and examine the words in which the question was articulated. For example...
Oh, you're in trouble now, Gilad.
No.
I'm dealing with a sociologist. What could I expect?
Yes, I
No,
can't
I
help
wanna hear.
it. But this is my project, is trying to ask questions about the terms through which we perceive these life experiences. So let's begin with childlessness, which of course refers to notions of lack, of having something which is there and which is not there. Today, we can also speak about child-free, and I'm not too comfortable with that term as well, because the experiences of not having children is articulated through choice or non-choice and misery and happiness. And this is something as a sociologist, I'm not comfortable because, of course, reality and lived experiences are much more nuanced than that.
And maybe because child-free also has a normative connotation as well, just in the other direction. Right?
Exactly. That's why in one of the papers I've written, which is not in my book, but could be downloaded through the journal Cultural Studies. In many ways, I warn against the single by choice rhetoric. Not that I undermine it, not that I think that it's not important. It is important. But first of all, it excludes many women who cannot afford to be single in terms of the lives are living, in terms of economical security, in terms even of their status in the community in which they live. And the second thing is that I think the choice and non-choice binary doesn't reflect the complexity of our emotional and everyday lives. We can, at one point in our life, be positive about singlehood, and at another point in our lives can be less positive, just as we can be sometimes very happily married and at other times not so happily married and not so sure if this was the right thing or this was the right person for us. I employ the same rhetoric also about childlessness and child-free, and the second word you used was problem. So I try to avoid looking at being childless, child-free, being single as a problem.
I particularly like, actually, how you turn the gaze on the sort of cultural norm of people being married. And you say, well, people ask you, or like your friend in the beginning of the book, why are you single? Or how is it being single or something? And you thought to yourself, why is nobody asking her, well, how's it going being married? Mm-hmm. Which is an interesting reversal, right? I mean, they are the majority, but presumably, but would you advocate a sort of sociological deconstruction of the concept of married life as well?
Definitely. And from a point of view which I hopefully will liberate sounds a bit dramatic, but let's try and be dramatic. Sunday, we can allow ourselves to be dramatic. So in some ways, even my book is not only intended for single persons. My book is also intended for providing more dreams and more life trajectories to women and men growing up, and also to women and men who are in relationships, good or bad, to affect the way that they perceive singlehood and affect the way they perceive their single daughters or single mothers, and also to provide more avenues, for example, for not remaining in an abusive relationships because singlehood is perceived to be, the horror, the worst thing that can possibly ever happen to a woman. So in that respect, trying to show in the book that we have more than one option, and more than that, more than one option, to try and challenge the hierarchy of the options. Not saying that singlehood is better than marriage or marriage is better than singlehood. It could be different options for different people at different stages in their lives.
And it sounds like you're really trying to break down the presumption, the sort of social construction, let's say, that married equals happy, single equals unhappy.
Definitely.
What is the genealogy of this? I mean, where did it come from that, this ominous specter of singlehood is the worst thing an adult can expect? Even, I think it's even more stigmatized than being childless, but in a couple.
I think it all came from the song. I think it all came from the song that you delightfully quote in the book, Eleanor Rigby. It all started with that, look at all the lonely people. Yeah. They die alone.
Yeah. Well,
no, but loneliness, I mean, this association of loneliness with being single in your marital context is different from just being lonely in general. It is still different.
I don't know.
No?
I don't know. It's the kind of beliefs we have about loneliness, togetherness, and aloneness, and the way we ascribe loneliness to be reside with the category of singlehood, and togetherness to be ascribed to non-loneliness. People can be very lonely in relationships. People can be very lonely in a party. People can be very lonely in family dinners, or even in your own birthday. You can feel very lonely when you are surrounded by all your friends. And what's so bad about being lonely, by the way? Why are we so afraid of being lonely? Loneliness can be a wonderful opportunity for thinking, for creativity. I need my time alone to think and create.
So why? What's the answer? Why are we so afraid?
I have another question that I think that it's going to solve everything. No, my question is that you're saying loneliness is not exclusively the domain of single people. It is pervasive in other areas of life. And I say, okay, but if we're going to analyze what your book is really about, it's also, and Gilad and I have thought long and hard about how to bring in a different song.
Yes.
Okay, and he's groaning. But the song is called Wasted Time. It's an Eagles song, for those of you who don't know. And it is a song about being single and wasting time. And isn't that really the theme of what you're saying? That there's a perception that we may be wasting our lives being alone.
Yeah, well, Chapter 5 tries to resist these assumptions. And, for example, try and figure out why, when you are in a couple or in a couple relationship, or you're married, time becomes an accumulation. You accumulate time, you accumulate capital, as opposed to a woman who is single, for example, or a man who is single who is just wasting their time, for example, on having a wonderful career, on traveling around the world. I don't know. There are so many examples of being an active member in the community, of being a teacher. There are so many ways, but the single status becomes such a master status of failure and waste and excessiveness of a thing which is not in its place, which in this particular chapter, I actually look at the ways in which the language of the market, of the marriage market, of the dating market, of the gender market, here meets with the language of time, and how time is perceived to be a resource, which is a sacred resource, which women are running out when they age and when they are perceived to be less beautiful and less reproductive and all that. I won't say the word. So,
okay, we're imagining the word here together. Yeah,
begins with a B. So I think, for example, rethinking the notion of wasting time is very significant in order to rethink how we think about singlehood. Because this is such, for example, a prominent injunction: don't waste your time, or don't waste your time on the wrong men. And if we look, if we located it in a broader spectrum and reevaluate the terms through which time is evaluated, we could find different conclusions and different assumptions about how people are evaluated.
Perhaps this is a question that should have been asked in the very beginning of this conversation, but it seems to me that it's pertinent now as well, that the concept of singlehood at the end of the day is very fluid. I mean, you mention in the book what kind of women you allude to. You don't include single moms, for example, and you do include divorced women. Oh, you don't? But at the end of the day, what my question to you now is that it doesn't really matter, does it?
Oh, it does.
Does it?
It does, definitely.
Oh, explain why.
Definitely, because singlehood is an intersectional category. And for example, the morality of a single woman without children as opposed to a single woman with children is totally different. Could be very different. And it could even become even more different if she's a single mom, for example, from an upper middle class, middle single mom, or a welfare mom. Okay? So the way society evaluates her or condemns her is very much defined and articulated through the parameters of children or through the parameters of class and race and nationality, etc. This goes as well to the question of divorce or widowhood. There are, of course, parameters which are in common, but still, for example, a woman who is divorced could be sometimes more easily figured out because a single woman who has never married is unclear. What kind of life does she lead? Has anyone actually ever chosen her? So is she marriageable material? And of course, I'm just referring here to all these conventions.
But it is interesting, just as an aside, that you point out that on the one hand, she gets blamed, maybe nobody ever chose her, but then she also gets harangued. Why isn't she working harder to make it happen? That's a common feedback that you cite against these women in the book. So they get it from both ends. You weren't chosen, but you're also not working hard enough yourself.
Definitely. And you're too selective and nobody wants you. So, of course, these cliches and assumptions have no logic, but they do not pretend to have any logic. They have their own internal logic. But when you group them together, you just hear this endless noise, which makes no sense and is not coherent and has so many contradictions in itself. And for the mere fact that it doesn't capture the complexity of our lives and the temporality of our lives and the fact that we are much more complex than we appear to be, whether we are single or coupled or a mom or not as a mom.
But one of the things that I think interesting is that you have, a very broad-ranging sense of this social construct, which you say is illogical, which we could talk about that separately, about whether it's really arbitrary and illogical. But what I want to ask you is about who is doing it. You write in one point, there's a quick quote, that the value of a single woman is determined by the evaluative gaze of men. And I don't know if that really summarizes the situation. I mean, don't we know that mothers and grandmothers and friends and aunts and the girlfriend you cite in your introduction, aren't they so much a part of this too?
Definitely. Everybody participates. And one of the sad things is that single women and single men themselves also participate in internalizing this violence, this intrusion of the way they evaluate themselves, the way they perceive their present and their future. So I've read many years ago, and I've written a short paper on it about a self-help book. I've analyzed self-help books for single persons. And one of them had a wonderful definition for what you were just referring to, which is called the friendly fire, which means that everybody participates in this friendly fire. And as, the stereotypical Jewish mom, I just want you to be happy. Okay, so we can deconstruct this notion of what does it mean to be happy and what kind of definitions of happiness are here. And are you supposed to be married just to make your mom happy?
Or is the real answer, I'd be happy if you'd stop haranguing me. Yeah.
I think that not many, but much of the research conducted on singlehood raises again and again that single persons say it's not so much singlehood, but it's more this constant nagging and intrusion than that the fact that everybody thinks they know how to live better than you, that this is something which makes them makes their life particularly
Now, that seems to me
difficult.
to apply to Israel more than anywhere else, if I may.
I know, I can't help but say that in many ways in Israel, people seem to think they know everything better than you about anything.
Even if they don't know you at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Israel-splaining.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, are these deep social constructs really all about constraining women, or is it a symbolic and evolutionary structure even that simply favors the social norms that are intended to, going back to childhood, that are intended to procreate? And for both men and women, and even not even just heterosexual couples, right? Even, the LGBT struggle is largely about marriage equality. People, seem to have this maybe biological or evolutionary inclination to prefer coupledom.
The question is, how do we define biology and evolutionary? Okay? Are we able to isolate them as parameters which just stand in itself and are not loaded with sociological and political and ideological contents? As a feminist sociologist, of course, I'm very suspicious whenever I hear the word evolutionary and biology, because these are exactly the terms that...
Somehow it's always slanted towards men.
Well,
right?
that's why I asked the question instead of letting Gilad ask the question, because I didn't want him to take any friendly fire.
Yeah, I just knew that I knew better that I should shut up before I even asked it. Anyway.
I always tell my students, these are the points in the text you analyze, in the questions you ask, that you become super suspicious. Because then if biology or evolutionary is utilized, then you're onto something.
All right, Dr. Kinneret Lahad, you're a senior lecturer in the Women and Gender Studies program at Tel Aviv University and the author of the recently published A Table for One, Rescheduling Singlehood and Time. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. Let me say, very generous. You too can help us survive, and you can have your name mentioned as a donor and other wonderful things. So if you want to do that, please write to us, and we'll tell you how to do it. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive on www.tlv1.fm/podcasts. We have over 400 interviews to keep you busy. Like us on Facebook. We're called the Tel Aviv Review Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.